that's great. We've had a flurry of people join us. So as I said earlier, thank you so much for being here with us and for giving us 45 minutes of your time. Joined today by John and Ian, who are both consultants in our people science team. And we'll be doing a deep dive into looking at leadership and what impact it has on engagement, and specifically what your own employees are telling us. So just a little bit about WorkBuzz for those of you that haven't worked with us before. So we are essentially a survey platform, but combined with some data analysis on the side of that by our people science team. So it's not just about getting good survey results and good response rates, it's about actually what we do with that data and how we can use that to drive actionable change and good insights across your departments. And as I said earlier, we're here today joined by Ian and John, who head up the people science side, and they will be taking a look into the leadership of employee engagement. So I'm going to hand over to John, who will be getting us started.
Thank you. So lovely to meet you in the virtual sense. John, working the head in the people science team, been serving employees for about 27 or so years. And the main thing that I do is try to make context to the table in terms of what people are thinking and feeling. And that's what the session is all about today, the context of how leadership has changed. I'm going to take us through some of the data, and then Ian's going to go in stuff that sits behind the data, the possible drivers of why people are feeling the way they're feeling about our leadership over the last couple of years and right now and beyond. In terms of the survey data, I want to start with the contextual piece, because I probably do about 2 or 3 executive presentations a week of employee survey data. And one of the main things that I say is, how good are the pilots? Because the surveys are picking up on that. So personally, I'm not the best flyer in the world. I get quite anxious flying. I don't really think of the quality of the pilots until we go through turbulence. And I think everything that we've been through is the equivalent of going through turbulence, where you suddenly think, well, how good are the pilots flying this plane, taking us through this? Will they get us through to the clear skies and beyond? So that is at the heart of everything that we're going to discuss today. In terms of the data, it's all telling us it's been a very, very tough time. So we served around 50,000 employees over time. Looking how their views on certain aspects of the employee experience have changed over that period. So the first place to start, and this is something in every single presentation that I'm giving to executive teams, we're talking about in great detail, it's how well-being of each of us has changed. I think there was a study actually this morning saying, I think it's around 3/4 of people saying their well-being is not in a great place at the moment, and is really important for them as well in the well-being strategy of organisations when they choose to work with them or even possibly leaving because of it. So over the previous few years, well-being initially tracked up at the start of COVID because we were concentrating more on people's well-being, safety. But after that period, it's been quite a downward spiral down to about 61 percentage points. And that's net positivity to the questions around well-being as a theme. So it is trending down. And as I said, in every single executive presentation I'm giving, we're talking very closely about this because of how people are feeling, working harder with less resource, finding out systems and processes that aren't working because they've got less resource to work around those systems and processes. So it's a really tough time when it comes to people's well-being, against the backdrop of everything that's probably been going on in our own lives and to our own families and health, etc. So the next port of call is around recognition. So it's been a really tough time, as I said in those executive presentations, saying time and time again, or people are telling us time and time again that they're having to do more with less, work harder and harder, longer hours, etc. Do they feel valued and appreciated for all that additional work and all that additional strain that they've been going through over the previous few years? So like wellbeing, it initially did go up, and then also it's been on a downward trend down to where we are in 2022. So that is a main thing that we've been covering in terms of those 2 items, and we'll get actually in a bit of depth into those in terms of are they important in driving engagement and other things as well. Now, interestingly, when we look at the scores to immediate management, they did go up the same as recognition and well-being, but they then remained high throughout and to now. So when we're talking about our own immediate manager, the key thing that we're picking up in the surveys, especially in the open comments, is people feeling almost on a similar level to their immediate manager, feeling that the immediate manager has empathy for the strain that they've been under, but actually saying I feel sorry in some instances for my own immediate manager who's had to backfill when people have gone off sick because of COVID and everything else we've going through. When people have left the team, the immediate managers has had to then backfill all that additional strain, in many instances falling back into an operational role, and that is coming out clear in the open comments in the data, that sense of empathy and alignment with your own immediate manager, feeling more like the strains that you personally have been going through throughout COVID. So that brings us then to the topic of today in terms of perceptions on leadership. Now, out of all the questions, this is the only one and the only theme that's been continually trending down and more significant than the others. So looking at the base size of the employees that we surveyed over this period of time, statistically speaking, probably something that went up or down by 1 or 2% hasn't happened by chance. So the fact that perceptions and leadership has gone from 71 down to 63 where we are now, it is not happened by chance. You know, it's a real difference in how we perceive our leaders. And often people are looking to their leaders to affect all the other things and how they're thinking and feeling around their well-being and their recognition, and helping immediate managers through that strain and then that stress and pressure that we've all been going through. So very enlightening in terms of looking at those data points and how they've changed. Now, I have picked on these in particular because we'll go through not only the impact on engagement, but something else we've been having a lot of discussion around with executive teams. So thinking big picture about some of these items and other items of the employee experience, this is the viewpoint pre-COVID. So the higher something appears, the happier people are with that particular theme or that particular part of their employee experience, the lower, the less happy they are with that element of their employee experience. From left to right, the further to the right something appears, statistically speaking, the greater the relationship or impact that theme is having on people's engagement. So anything in the bottom right-hand quadrant, relatively speaking, people are saying, I'm not happy with this theme, but the analysis says, relatively speaking, they're very important in driving people's engagement. Pre-COVID, local teamwork, sort of silo working, lack of collaboration, we're in that sort of bottom right-hand quadrant, along with alignment to purpose. If you look at where leadership was on the grid, so it was still relatively important, mid-table in terms of perception and score. It was in that 70-odd% if you saw from the previous slide. So the really interesting viewpoint is when we then look at how that changed coming out the other side of COVID. So as you've seen, as I've highlighted, leadership, as we've seen, has got lower in terms of the satisfaction with that as an element of your employee experience, but far, far more important in terms of its impact on engagement. Well-being, not only has the score gone down over time, but that's become far more important, as has recognition and growth to some extent. Anything around the periphery of that bottom right-hand quadrant, relatively lower scoring, but relatively more impactful on engagement, especially leadership, which could be at the heart of impacting all these other things around the periphery and many other things on this. Now, we talk about engagement a lot and the drivers of engagement, but it's not just about engagement as a standalone measure, because engagement is a proxy measure for many other things happening to our organisation in terms of its performance metrics. So this is just a case study from ourselves, looking at the close link across a whole organisation's turnover data, voluntary turnover, and its engagement score. So the more dots that appear across that line of best fit, the closer the relationship between the two. And actually, statistically, there was a very close relationship between turnover and engagement. So when we're talking about the elements of the employee experience that drive engagement, we're also talking about the elements of the employee experience that drive other things like attrition, which is the main discussion that we're having with all our clients at the moment around retention and attraction. Not only that they're closely associated, when one thing changes, the other thing changes. So between two survey points where engagement declines, turnover was twice as likely to increase. That just shows the strength of the relationship. And it's not just about engagement. It's what engaged people do. They stay with us longer, they work harder, they're happier, have better levels of well-being and everything else. And to very quickly just drive that message home a little bit further, when we're talking about the link between engagement and attrition and the same factors driving both. This is a Brucey bonus, for not in the report. This is something else I pulled from elsewhere in terms of evidence. But when you take the same group of people who said actually intended to leave during an employee survey, and then those same people actually then ended up leaving their organisation, the top 3 items of reason for leaving, whether it's during your stay with an organisation at point of exit, top 3 are still the top 3. And that's around, I don't feel appreciated, my job's negatively affecting my well-being, and other jobs have more benefits or better pay, which actually decreases at time of exit compared to when you intend to leave an organisation. So again, just to drive home the message, the same drivers that points to the employee experience driving engagement are the same drivers driving attrition in effect. And very quickly across all the different survey questions around leadership, bringing those together, you can see here the closer to a 4 score means it's the highest possible impact on engagement. And these are the ones that had lower relative score. So the score is the net positive score to each of these questions. And this is across all that 50,000 employee base as well. So, for example, only 37% of those 50,000 employees feel that change is well managed in their organisation. Only 50% feel communication from leaders is open and honest. Only 40% generally feel their organisation is well led overall. Now, to put that in layman's terms, and what is that telling us? So this is almost a secret sauce from the surveys around leadership. I need more confidence that the organisation is being well led, have greater trust in the organisation and in the communications from leaders being open and honest. I need greater belief that we're being taken in the right direction by leaders, back to my analogy on the pilots. I need more proof that leaders are role modelling our behaviours through these turbulent times, that you're listening to me and acting on my feedback. I need much better experience of management of change, because we've had to change far more readily throughout COVID and remain more agile. And I need to feel much greater level of empowerment to have a culture of innovation and ideas sharing. So now that's all the data in a nutshell, just telling you what your employees themselves have been telling us about leadership in general. Lots to take away from there, but Ian is actually then going to go into the detail behind many of the reasons why potentially people are giving these scores and what we can do about them. Thank you, Ian.
Oh, thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. So what I'll do is look at trends in behaviour and trends in the economy which have driven these changes. It's not just about pandemic and what's happened over the last 2 years. Some of this has been happening before that. Looking at the trends in terms of leadership behaviour. So I tend to work a lot at C-suite and a lot at board level, trying to help organisations understand how they need to change behaviour within leaders. And that's leaders at all levels. So we're not just talking about top table leaders, we're talking about leaders throughout the organisation in terms of team leaders or team managers or anybody who's a people manager throughout the organisation. So I think first of all, just to kind of go back in time a little bit, to be honest, the workplace has been changing for some time. So what we've seen over the last 2 years is a real acceleration of changes that's been going on for some time. So if you look at what's on the slide from left to right, you're almost looking at a timeline there. So even in the kind of late 90s and into the 2000s, we were all talking about flexible way working and new ways of working. And what we've seen over the pandemic is obviously that accelerated when we all went into lockdown and were pushed into our own homes, if you were obviously in those kind of roles. But flexible working has been here for a long time. I mean, myself in my own position, I'm either working with clients, at a client, or I'm working from home or working in an office. So it's nothing new per se, but it's accelerated for lots of people and is new for lots of people as well. And they've moved into that area pretty quickly. I think the other point about what's accelerated a lot of the change in leadership is the disruption of traditional sectors, and we all see that very visibly on the high street and the number of stores and shops that have disappeared over time, and the move to online shopping. And you know, if you think about it, you know, 15 years ago, if you'd have wanted a taxi, you'd have either stuck your hand out if you're in London or maybe in a big city, on the street corner, or you would have rang a number and spoke to a taxi company. Who would have thought you'd have done that through an app on the phone now? You know, and that's for lots of us. Ordering food, you know, and takeaways. If you wanted a takeaway, you went to the takeaway and you walked through the door and ordered it and picked it up. Who would have thought that food would be delivered so easily now, whether it be by bicycle, as you can see there, or delivered to your house by car? So there's a real disruption in traditional sectors, and as leaders, we've had to react to that, particularly if the competition to your particular organisation is changing rapidly. We've needed to respond and manage and lead in a different way. I think there's also a change in the makeup of workforces. I don't want to get into a big debate about generational differences, but certainly if you think of millennials, the oldest millennial at the moment is probably about 37, 38. So millennials in many ways are probably the biggest proportion of any of our workforces across organisations. And you know, I think some of the traits of generations are overplayed, but certainly the generation of millennials, they certainly want more participation. They certainly want to move quicker within the organisations. Lots of them buy into the kind of gig economy. So if you're my age, certainly in your mid-50s, when I was younger and started out in work life, it was much more about get your head down, work hard, and you'll have a long career with the organisation. People are much more accepting now of that generation that they'll only stay for 1, 2, 3 years maximum and then move on. So there's a real change in the way people in that generation think about work. They want more participation, they move on quicker, there's much more churn, and they relate much more to purpose. They want a purpose for being, a purpose for their work. And similarly, they look for values that align. So, you know, when doing interviews, again, 20 years ago, the questions that you were asked at the end of the interview were always around career development or reward or recognition. Now the questions are much more likely to be, you know, what are your values and how do I align to them? Or currently it's much more around, you know, what's the working pattern in terms of where I'm going to be working in terms of hybrid. So we're changing rapidly, and as leaders, you know, we've had to adapt to a number of changes that have been happening over 20, even 30 years. I'm finding keeping skills and talent, that's changing at the moment. So employee value proposition, EVP, recruitment and retention are high on everybody's list of things. And again, as leaders, we've got to respond to these. And I guess the one big thing about the pandemic is we quickly had to reimagine the workplace, almost and literally overnight. So how were we agile as leaders? How did we manage that process? Was it quick? You know, everybody picked up the laptops, went home, or whatever it might be, or was it a real pain to do? Did we have the technology in place? Did we have the ability to communicate with people easily? I heard stories in the first lockdown of people who were still using huge computer towers and big screens in offices, and they were literally going in with wheelbarrows to load this stuff into the car to work from home in first lockdown. But as leaders, we need to anticipate that more and be much more agile. So the workplace has been changing for some time. That's a message. It's not just about the last 2 years. And the big question at the moment is where and how we'll work. It's real top of mind for organisations. The move to hybrid has really been driven by the employee base, not necessarily leaders of organisations. I'm sure if boards of directors were locked behind doors and you spoke to them in private, the vast majority would want people back into the office. But hybrid for the moment is certainly here to stay. So, you know, this concept of working from home or working from work or working from anywhere where you're most productive, or indeed speaking to some of the house builders, excuse me, speaking to some of the house builders, they are looking at building in any new housing development, they're looking to put offices in the heart of the development, so that, you know, if you want an office location to work in with fast internet, you walk across the road or around the corner and you're in an office environment. So there's people thinking hard about what this actually means, and hybrid working has got lots of positives. There's lots of positives around productivity. There's lots of positives around work-life balance. There's lots of positives around how people actually feel about working from home and working in a hybrid way. But there's also lots of negatives as well. John showed you the chart, for example, around recognition. And recognition is tough. You know, if you're working from home, if you're in the office together and you see somebody, I don't know, working late in the office, it's very easy to walk up to them and say, hey, I saw you putting the extra effort in last night. That was brilliant. Thanks very much for your time, effort and work. If you're remote, I've got to look at your diary. I've got to look at my own diary. I've got to schedule some time to call you. I've got to make the effort to do that and say, thank you very much for the effort. And most people, most leaders who are time poor, for them, it's just one task too many. So recognition, for example, is declining because it's the effort to do it is stopping people from doing it. So we've got to think hard about hybrid working. It's evolving and it's moving and it's changing, and there's lots of positives, but there's also lots of negatives as well. You know, how do you make sure people have fun at work? How do you make sure you you create a culture? How do you make sure you create team cultures? You know, we used to see in surveys that people stayed for the manager or stayed for the team they work with. But if you're not working with your manager day to day or the team, what's binding you to organisations now? What's keeping people in organisations? So there's lots still to work through in terms of hybrid working and to get right. And in terms of that, you know, we need to decide what the workplace is for and what working from home is for. And it might be that we think about, rather than the location of work, we think about the type of work we're doing. So if you need to collaborate with teams, without a shadow of a doubt, coming into the office or work location is the place to be, to get everybody together. If you're concentrating on a singular task, writing a report or something, why would you come into work? You can do that from home, and you can do that in the kind of privacy and the quiet of your own house. So what we need to think about, I think, is not necessarily the location, the geography of work, but the type of work we're doing, so that we still get activation, we still get innovation, we still get all those good team building and culture moments, and the moments that matter. So how and where we work is really top of mind for many people. And for many, you know, we've saw, and you've told the press over the last few years, that, you know, this stuff is real. It's not just stuff you see on the TV, and it's not just stuff you see in newspapers or on the net, and it's not just the stuff we see in surveys. It's real. You know, the shortages, vacancies are at 1.3 million in the first quarter of this year. People are talking about churn. I was talking to a manufacturing organisation, which is in quite a, they manufacture paper products, so it's things like toilet rolls and paper towels, you see, and stuff like that. And it's quite a dusty environment when they first start manufacturing this stuff. And they advertised a job in the factory and got 0 responses, 0 CVs or inquiries on the job. Because quite simply, if you're working manufacturing, you can go down the road and work in a pristine plant where it's almost surgically clean, and you're not going to come home full of dust and dirt and whatever else. So people have choice. It's really tough at the moment to recruit into environments where, you know, work is hard and dirty and murky and whatever else. So there's a huge number of factors that we're dealing with. But there's a number of other factors, you know, big macro factors around the impact of Brexit. You know, we saw lots of people at Brexit point returning to their home countries, in particular people from Eastern Europe. And you'll have read stories about farmers not being able to pick crops and having to plough crops back into the ground. The hospitality industry, lots of people from Eastern Europe works in that, the building industry, etc., etc. So there was a huge impact around Brexit. And the same with COVID. You know, when COVID hit, people went home again, returning to the home country. So there was a double whammy inside kind of a 3 to 4 year period in terms of the workforce being decreased and people with skills going back to their home countries. That's no bad thing, because those economies benefited from that, but at the detriment of our own. Hospitality staff not returning post-pandemic, really key. Speaking to people in the hospitality industry, they're really struggling at the moment, simply because when pandemic came and lockdowns came, the hospitality industry, the pubs and restaurants and bars, were the first to be hit and first to be closed, and people lost their livelihoods. You know, there wasn't much furlough in that industry, or there certainly was at the beginning, but not towards the end. So when we were in lockdown 3 or 4, how many there were, people lost their livelihoods, and it's seen as quite a risky industry to go back to now, and they're struggling badly to recruit. And they used to recruit on the basis that it was fun. It was fun to work as a team in a pub or a bar or a restaurant. It was fun, and there was lots of energy around it. But at the moment, they've not got that behaviour to recruit to, because it's not fun, because they're stretched. They've not got enough people in the bars and restaurants, so it's hard work at the minute, and really tough to recruit. Similarly, the care sector, struggling with pay and rewards and shortages caused by the pandemic. HGV drivers, we saw at Christmas time empty shelves on supermarkets because deliveries weren't coming from suppliers. And the change in lifestyle as well. Obviously, over the pandemic, there was lots of early retirees who took the opportunity to leave their roles. There was lots of people who had a kind of conscience type thing and thought about what's important to them and decided that they didn't want to work in where they were. But there was also changes in terms of people's behaviour. So there's an estimate of around about 750,000, nearly 750,000 more casual drivers in the economy. So people who are delivering things like, you know, your online order for clothes or food or anything else for that matter in their own personal vehicle or small van. And there's about 750,000 more of those in the economy. And they were people who moved from jobs which would sometimes shift work. So they'd be, you know, working night shifts or whatever. And they've moved to roles which is much more satisfactory to their lifestyle, if you like, so they can work when they want, the hours they want. And that's caused real problems. And we saw that recently in the airports, which with not enough baggage handlers and security staff, because the people left in the pandemic and just never came back to those industries. And then hybrid working, we've mentioned that, the kind of work from anywhere attitude has changed. And recently people have started talking about the great rebound. But I guess until we sort out recruitment and retention issues, we're not going to see that rebound in terms of the way we work. Maybe a rebound in terms of revenues and profits and whatever else, but certainly not in terms of the way people are resourcing their organisations. And leadership is critical through all this because, you know, people start to feel it, and we saw it again, you know, with the airports. If you think that the chief executive of Manchester Airport lost the job or moved on, certainly over this last few months, you know, because it was felt that the situation was untenable. You know, the leadership was lacking in terms of this area. You know, people were questioning why they let so many people go over the pandemic period. So the leadership in terms of all of these different measures in the care homes and care sector, in terms of HGV drivers, in terms of supermarket shelves, leadership has been critical to take organisations through this turmoil that's been caused over the last few years. And what we've got a result now is a war for talent, and how do you manage that process? So there's just some stats down the side there to sort of say, you know, any study you look at currently and any study you were looking at towards the end of last year was showing that it's going to carry on for the near future. You know, the latest one there is the PwC survey in May this year, you know, only a couple of months ago. And that showed that still around a fifth of UK workers are saying that they're going to move into new roles in the next 12 months. So that churn, that kind of change in the makeup of the world and the makeup of the workforce is going to continue for the near future. I don't like the term great resignation. I just think it's a kind of change and right sizing of the workforce and workforce makeup and structure. But it's still a churn, and we're still seeing that kind of continue. So people realizing that there's opportunities elsewhere, people wanting to get out from traditional industries, people think, you know, organizations insisting that people go back to the office and thinking, well, I can work from home for anybody else. I don't have to work for you if you want me back in the office. And companies being quite aggressive with it. There's a law firm, it was on the BBC website, there's a law firm in London that said if you want to work from home, you've got to take a 20% pay cut. If you come into the office, you can maintain your salary. And that's quite an aggressive stance to take in terms of current market where people can easily move jobs and work from home quite comfortably. So, you know, organisations and leaders have to tread carefully in terms of how they approach talent and how they treat their employees, because people will vote with their feet and will move. Even in the first, when we were going through lockdown periods, Goldman Sachs were the first to break, and the chief exec there said, when this is all over, everybody will be back to the offices, and we're demanding that. And I think they got about 120,000 people globally, and I think they had around 6,500 resignations in the month after he announced that. Similarly, Apple wanted everybody back into their offices in California, and again there was I'm going to say workforce rebellion. It wasn't that strong, but certainly they reversed that, and I think they're down to kind of 3 days in and 2 days out kind of thing. So the drive for hybrid working and the changes that we've seen across a number of years are driving this war for talent, and leaders are critical in managing these processes.
Just one point to add on this as well. Having quite a few conversations with organisations, and this is coming from employees themselves saying, yeah, it's been a really tough time. We've had a resource crunch. We've got fewer people. We're having to do more. And when I ask them, why are you having to do more? They say it's because we're working very inefficiently and ineffectively. We could actually probably get away with a lower headcount if we actually had, get rid of the duplication, the bureaucracy, the red tape, if we can have quicker decision making, if we can have better technology and more effective, frictionless working in place. So that is one possible solution as well to headcount crunch. Here's Ian. Let me just move to the next one.
So if you think of, if you kind of encompass everything I've talked about, what we found is post-pandemic is organisations being more human, and I say that in kind of inverted commas, but treating people as a human being. So we've got a different experience that people crave. They're looking for these moments that matter across the organisation and across their life cycle. Where it's built around the needs of employees, kind of humans first, building and solutions second kind of thing. Whereas in the past, it wasn't always the case. So if we've got these moments that matter, which are critical to employee engagement and employee experience and employee satisfaction, leaders by nature have to change. They have to change the way they think, they have to change the way they behave, and they have to do things differently. So the 5 key things that we're seeing across surveys, that the experience challenges, if you like, that people are looking for, is this need to understand how people feel at every touch point of their experience in the organisation. So from onboarding and coming into the organisation, and how you onboard and how you go through your induction and all the rest of it, all the way through to exiting the organisation. How does that feel? But all those moments that matter right across that journey, from getting training, from perhaps being promoted, from perhaps leading people when you've never led people before, to life events, if you go on maternity or paternity leave, or long-term sick perhaps, to training and developments and career developments. How are you treated? How are those moments that matter? How are you led at those different points in time, and how are you treated by the organisation? So leaders are having to understand those touch points much more, and be much more personal about how they understand individuals. You can no longer be a team manager. You're managing teams of individuals, and how do you relate to each individual? Culture has become critical. As I said, the glue that binds people to organisations is the purpose, value, and goals. Particularly if you're remote, as I said, you don't have that personal contact as often as we did in the past. So culture has to be spot on. And even in a hybrid world, how do you create a culture that spans that hybrid world as well? So it's really important that we get to grips with that, and leaders understand that as well. Processes and systems, John just talked to that as well. How do you process and systems support the employee experience? Really critical. We're all on Zoom, we're all on Teams, we're all on Slack. But are there any other communication vehicles that might work better for you, or different for you? How do we support employees wherever they're working, and how does that work? How does your technology work? And that, in terms of that, how does the technology allow employees to be the best wherever they are? So, John's in the office there. I'm actually in a hotel today at a conference. So the technology is working fine. So, but it's not always the same for everybody. How do you ensure that technology works, and employees have fast links? So if they're working from home, are they on slow internet links, and is that frustrating them? Voice, always critical, but are people empowered so that they have the freedom to challenge, innovate, and be agile in the roles? We want people to do that. Working from home, one of the positive side effects is that people have had to take many more decisions than they would have done in an office environment. So sometimes you take there's a decision to be made, And you might turn to colleagues and say, what do you think? And I'm going to do this and this, that, and the other. Whereas when people have worked from home over the last 2 years, they've been making those decisions and having the confidence to do that. And so empowerment has been something that a real kind of positive shift from a hybrid role. So how do we encourage that more? How do we get more out of people in terms of being able to challenge and innovate and be agile and make things better as they go along?
Just to quickly add another one is the learning thing. Actually, for people that don't know Ian, myself, Ian was my boss many years ago, and I learned by sitting and listening to Ian on his many phone calls and watching him present, and just like you said, being able to turn to Ian and say, what do you think about this? And that gets lost a little bit with hybrid working, because you just can't do that readily, especially if it's someone earlier in their career that sort of need that shadowing and that coaching.
Yeah, and that's a critical thing from leaders. You know, how do you ensure that still happens in a hybrid world? How do you do that post-pandemic when your colleagues are split across different geographic locations? So what are these key employee touch points? You know, as I said, there's 5 challenges there, 5 areas that we need to get right. But what are these touch points? Where have we ended up after COVID, in this post-pandemic world? What are the employee touch points that we need to understand? Well, one of them is culture and the work environment, and that includes hybrid. So we've got to get that right. We've got to make sure that, you know, all the positives that you get from hybrid, but are countered by the negatives, that we get rid of those negatives. So how do we recognize people easily? How do we learn from each other? That kind of learning that John talked about, you know, how do we ensure that still happens? How do we communicate better and well? You know, I'm sure lots of you are kind of Zoom and Teamsed out at the minute. So how do we ensure that that's not the case going forward? So culture and the work environment is critical. Technology, I've mentioned, it's critical that we continue to invest in technology, make sure that's right. Leadership in its widest sense. So people, managers, all the way down through the organization. It's not just about the leaders around the top table getting this stuff right. We have to ensure that we're coaching and mentoring leaders at every single level throughout the organization to get it right. So there's a consistent approach. Reward and recognition, top of everybody's head at the moment, where, you know, and you see in organizations like PwC, I mentioned earlier, just awarded a 9% increase to all their employees to counter what's happening in the economy at the moment with fuel and energy prices going through the roof. Another organization offering one-off payments to help people. So there's reward and recognition is very much top of mind for people. And in the war for talents, you've obviously, when we're talking about roles where they're earning X per hour, you know, an organization down the road that suddenly increases their hourly rate by a £1 or £2 or £3, you know, suddenly jumps the gun and we get wage spiraled. So there's a lot of work to do around that, and really critical at the minute. Career development's coming to the fore as well, in terms of presenteeism and in terms of how people are working hybrid. You know, we've got to ensure that there's an equal culture, that people who choose to come into the office 5 days a week, for example, that they don't get all the career development, and somebody who chooses to work hybrid gets ignored. So that kind of issue around equality of development is critical. And employees are seeing that, employees spot that, and, you know, how equal is everything in the workplace now. And strategy and change management, in terms of managing change, and in terms of managing strategic direction, how good are we at communicating that when we've not got everybody to hand? So these key employee touch points across the employee experience are really ones that they build on culture and they build on engagement. But it's much more human now, that we need to think as leaders about the human context of this. Organizations are becoming more human. And as, in that way, as leaders, we've got to become more human. So we're seeing, you know, leaders, I guess, in organizations, they were much more traditionally around strategic thinking, around results, you know, profit, revenues, whatever, around, you know, communication. But as you can see now, the leader has to be much more than that. And this is leaders at the top level or throughout the organization. So they've still got to do the strategic thinking. You know, that's what leaders pay for, the big picture, the long-term thinking. Got to be agile as well. You know, the World Health Organization talks about the rise in zoonotic diseases. So in the last 50 years, we've seen a huge number of zoonotic diseases, i.e. diseases that pass from animals to humans. So if you go all the way back, you know, you were looking at Zika virus and AIDS and SARS and swine flu, etc., all the way now to COVID, which, you know, as long as you don't believe the conspiracy theory, it came from bats. So you've got these zoonotic diseases which are on the rise, because as humans, we're going into parts of the planet which we've never been before. So we're going to come across more and more of these. And who are predicting that the last pandemic isn't the last one we're going to see in our working lifetimes? So the last 50 years has seen a huge increase in these diseases, even down to the cases. Is it monkeypox over the last few weeks that we've seen in the UK? It's 100 odd cases of that. So again, we're seeing these zoonotic diseases, and the potential for another one coming along is quite high, actually. So agile thinking around, you know, if another one does come along and we end up in lockdown, or a more serious variant of COVID comes along, you know, that it's much more of a serious disease, a killer, if you like, that comes along. How agile are we as organizations? Can we think quickly and move quickly? Secondly, I think they've got to create results-based cultures. So clear priorities, empowerment, and creating accountability. And the move towards OKR thinking is part of that process, and many organizations are moving towards that. Talent management, I'd say critical at the moment in terms of attracting and developing and retaining key talent, making sure that your employee value proposition stands out, making sure you differentiate your organization as an employer. The agility, initiating change, encouraging improvement, and celebrating different thinking. You know, what gets lost in the whole hybrid world as well is innovation. You know, how do we innovate as organizations if we're geographically spread? How do we think about innovation? Who innovates in organizations? So that's critical. Nurturing, coaching, mentoring, learning, seeking high potential, etc. All key areas now. And then we get into these softer, kind of more human areas, which traditionally leaders left to HR people or comms people or whatever else. We need leaders now who are open, who are able to listen, who communicate authentically, because that's critical again when you've got geographic spread, who lead by example, who admit mistakes, who show some humility in how they work. And humanity, they build trust, and trust is a real critical currency at the moment in organizations in terms of how they work, but also shows empathy and compassion. You know, we've all been through really tough times, either in our personal lives or our work lives or whatever it might be over the last 2 years. And particularly those employees who've had to work through lockdowns, you know, on trains or in factories who've still had to produce food, and they've still had to go in on the front line and be customer facing in supermarkets and things like that. You know, we need leaders who are compassionate about what people have gone through and the potential burnout of individuals. So what we've seen is a number of changes have been happening for years, a number of factors that have emerged which are important to colleagues in our own businesses, and an approach to leadership which has to take account of all that. So leaders still have to do everything they've done in the past, but they need to add in now a more human nature. And listening is key. You've got to listen to your employees and crowdsource opinion, and do your surveys and all the rest of it, so that we understand how people feel. Hybrid's here to stay, so we may as well get with the program and make sure that our leaders at all levels are doing lots of these things, and relying on leaders to adapt and change. People look to leaders to make sure things are okay. They look for confirmation that we're okay here, we can manage this situation, we can get through it, we can get out to the side. So that kind of process where leaders are able to adapt and change and be agile and be able to communicate future direction is really important as well. So in your own organizations, worthwhile thinking about this, worthwhile thinking about your senior leadership, worthwhile thinking about how you drive this thinking and this way of working down through your own leadership teams, so that you're all in line, and how you change the mindsets of leadership. Really critical at the moment. We're entering a new phase in this post-pandemic world of just kind of cementing some of the things that we've learned and are coming out the other side.
That's great. Thank you so much. Ooh. There's some technical difficulties that we discussed. Hang on. That better? No. Do you...
Try again.
There we go. You think after however many years of doing this, we'd be able to have that now by now. Thank you so much, John and Ian, for the insights there. It's all really, really interesting. Thank you to everyone who joined us this afternoon. We'll send through a recording of the webinar. I'll cut out that end bit, and I'll also share the ebook and the data source that we referenced at the beginning. But thank you so much, guys. We'll share any future updates, any future content with you tomorrow.
Yeah. Have a fantastic day, everybody.
Thank you. All the best.